And it's nice, thank you. I'm delighted to be here, yes. Actually, I've been judicial vicar before I was pastor. I was judicial vicar from 1980 to 2013, and worked in the tribunal from 1970. I was ordained in 1968. So, and I've always been a parish priest. It didn't matter. Wherever I was started out in Middlesex, which is now in the other diocese. I came to Trenton, to Blessed Sacrament. I was there for 8 years. I went to St. Anne's for 3 years, pastor of St. Francis for 22 and a half years till it closed. And then, and from 2002 to 2012, I was, 2011, I'm sorry. I was rector of the cathedral. In 2002, 2005, I was also administrator of St. Joseph's Church. So I've been around, but all in Mercer County, except for 4 years. And I've been doing this ministry. I'm messing with this, and it's not a good idea. Hold on. I shouldn't be touching this. I shouldn't be. I'm going to be in trouble here. You know what? There we are. Okay, there we are. Good. Going to start over again. Keep my hands off that. So anyway, when I was asked to do this, I was initially told the topic was convalidating marriages. Then I got no, actually the original topic was the irregular marriage, and I thought, well, that's an interesting topic because I'm not sure what people would understand by that. Then it was convalidating marriages, and then finally I saw the topic in your bulletin, coming home for couples who were married outside the church. And I hope you're going to let me focus with that title. In fact, many couples never left, even if they married outside the church. They never left. Many of them continue to go to Mass regularly, participate as well as they could as Catholics. And so, how do you title something like this? The point is, how do you title something like this when the circumstances are so very different? But the focus is really what I said here. For full practice of the Catholic faith, a person who is married needs to be married Catholic. To fully practice your faith. You're not excommunicated if you're not. If you're not married in the church, you're not excommunicated. But your participation is somewhat significantly limited. And so the real issue I want to focus on, and whether you're here because you need it or because you know somebody who does, I hope we all know somebody, me too, who does, you can get information that may be helpful here. So the focus of the presentation really is, if you're not married in the church, how do you do it? And especially if you're already married, but not by the church, how do you get that fixed? That's really the focus of my talk tonight. You're Catholic and married, but not married according to the Catholic Church, but by an official of the state, by clergy of another religion. If you're not married at all, people who are living together who are not married at all, it's just like the bride and groom who were never married. You don't have any issues about getting married in the church if you're not married at all. If neither one's been married before, you're not married at all, or widows and widowers, you don't need to worry about that. That's not an issue. It's people that are already married in some other way, Catholics who are already married in some other way than the church recognizes. And usually at this point somebody wants to ask me, well, what about common law? Well, the state of New Jersey doesn't recognize common law. They have a kind of palimony, so if two people who are living together without benefit of marriage separate and want to sue each other to divide the properties, a judge can litigate that, can decide it. But we don't have common law marriage in the state of New Jersey. So I'm not considering that here. But the result of not being married in the Catholic Church for most Catholics means they feel excluded from the Catholic Church, even though I said you're not. They're not excommunicated, but they feel excluded because they may not receive Holy Communion in that situation, and in that situation, they may not be a sponsor at baptism or confirmation. They also can't be a lector, they can't be a Eucharistic minister, technically they can't if you have adult servers at Mass, they're not supposed to be serving. In other words, their participation is somewhat limited. So the question is what to do to have the marriage recognized by the Catholic Church and to enable one to receive the sacraments and to participate fully in the Church. Now, you start with the simplest, and that is to be married in the Catholic Church, to go through a marriage ceremony according to the Catholic Church's rituals. That's the simplest solution, becoming married in the Catholic Church. And if you're already married by some other means, we call that convalidation. We are already married in a way recognized by the state, and both of us are free to marry according to Catholic Church teaching, meaning you've not had a prior marriage, or if you have, the prior spouse is dead, or you have a church annulment. Both of us are free to marry according to the Catholic Church teaching. And both of us are willing to have a marriage ceremony according to the Catholic form and ritual. Believe it or not, it's that third point that often serves as a sticking point, as an area of difficulty and challenge. And we're going to be talking about that a little bit later, about what to do when one person isn't willing. Can you still have the Church recognize your marriage if the other party doesn't want to participate in a marriage ceremony? Convalidation means you get up before the priest and two witnesses and you renew the wedding vows. It's a ceremony. And some people don't want to do that again. And when we get to that, I'll talk a little bit more about that. To marry in a Catholic ceremony, you certainly need an interview with the parish priest or deacon, and you may need more than one. You need documents, the certificates of sacraments received, proof of freedom to marry, which again is either you've never been married before, or a death certificate of the former spouse, or you have a church annulment, a certificate of civil or religious marriage to each other. Remember, we're convalidating a marriage. So you got to have a marriage in place, civil or religious by another church, in place to do this. And then you have special marriage preparation. Now, why did I say that? Because oftentimes people that have been married to each other for some time aren't looking for pre-Cana. They're not looking for engaged encounter. And marriage encounter may or may not be appropriate for them. There is, if there's been a divorce and remarriage, there is a program called To Trust Again that can be a marriage preparation program. But this is the point where you work with the parish priest or deacon to determine what preparation you need as a couple. What does this couple need to be ready to marry in the church? There are all sorts of things that are there, and who do you go to for that? Well, in our diocese, it's the Family Life Office that has those resources available. But again, you don't have to do this alone. You kind of walk with somebody, your parish priest or deacon, hopefully. Many of our parishes now have some lay people trained to help with marriage preparation. And where you have that, they too can work with you on what do you do, what kind of marriage preparation might be needed to marry in a Catholic ceremony. Once you have the Catholic ceremony, and the picture shows a bishop with a couple, looking at it, I almost think it looks more like an anniversary blessing, but it could be a case of a number of people having their marriages validated at the same time. A wedding ceremony takes place with at least the spouse and two witnesses, with a Catholic priest or deacon officiating. That's the least. Can other people come? Are they welcome? Can you have guests? Certainly. But ordinarily, I shouldn't say ordinarily. I should say in my pastoral experience, because nothing is really ordinary anymore. I mean, the varieties all over the place. But in my experience as a priest, even up to the time I finished at the cathedral, generally when people were convalidating marriage, most of the people didn't know that they weren't married by the church. And they didn't want to call attention to it. So they didn't want any publicity. They didn't want banns announced. They didn't want any kind of public ceremony. They didn't want to invite anybody because they didn't want people talking. And out of sensitivity for that, the church says that you can do this with just the priest or the deacon. The people who need this can do it with the priest or deacon, the couple that needs to get married, and two witnesses, period. There were times when the situation was so unknown in the community and the people so sensitive that I did the marriage in the rectory, which is okay. It used to be years ago you might have to do that, but now you don't. But I did the marriage in the rectory with a custodian and housekeeper as the witnesses. That just because of the sensitivity of the situation. But it doesn't have to be that way. So seeing a crowd there, no, you don't have to validate in front of a lot of people. That isn't necessary. The fact of the wedding is then recorded in the parish marriage register. A Catholic marriage certificate can be issued, and the Catholics in the marriage are now able to participate fully in their Catholic faith. You will have two marriage certificates then. You'll have the certificate of marriage. The couple has the certificate of marriage where they got married the first time, and they have the certificate of Catholic marriage. For civil purposes, for any civil purposes, one has to use the civil marriage record. Used to be the state that accepted, but they can't. No state does that anymore. Everybody relies on the state records. So you have the state record, that's what's really important. And then the church record you have for your own records. And again, it's registered, and it's in the register, and a certificate can be issued at any time showing that the couple is now married in the church and able to participate fully in the Catholic faith. Usually, either, some priests like to do before, some after. Advise the couple to receive the sacrament of reconciliation, to go to confession. My practice was always to say, do it before the wedding, maybe the day before, whatever, but do it before you marry in the church. But technically, you can still marry validly in the church and go to confession afterwards. And there were spiritual reasons for pastors choosing that route. So if for example, you know of a situation where the pastor said, no, you'll go to confession after you do this, fine. If the pastor said you go to confession before you do this, fine. But because I couldn't put all that in a slide, I figured I would mention it and not put it down here. But yes, the sacrament of reconciliation is always should be part of this return to the full practice of one's faith. It can be done before. I think it's better to do it before, but it can be done before or after the validation ceremony. But is there an alternative? If one spouse is unwilling to have a marriage ceremony in the Catholic Church, yes. The remedy is to request of the bishop a radical sanation of the marriage. What on earth is that? The term radical sanation literally means healing, that's radical. Healing, sanation, radical at the roots. Literally healing at the roots. And it's a retroactive validation of the marriage that took place in a way that the Catholic Church could not recognize. What it's saying is, I'll say John and Mary got married by the mayor of Hamilton Township in 2005, and in 2015 they want to have their marriage validated. People often say blessed. I like to use the word validated because there's a little more than a blessing involved. They want to have their marriage validated and accepted by the Catholic Church, but one of the parties isn't willing to do it. And so the action, the sanation, actually takes as the date of marriage the 2005 date. And the church, the bishop, retroactively accepts it. If you think that stretches the imagination, wait till you see the rest of this, okay? But it's literally healing at the roots. It literally makes the marriage valid from the first day it was entered into invalidly. If because of divorce, this is the other issue, if because of divorce one or spouses are unable to marry in the Catholic Church, and there we're looking if neither had a prior marriage, and if either had a prior marriage and the former spouse is still alive, a process of church annulment or dissolution of the former marriage is required. Now I can't do a whole presentation on annulments and dissolutions tonight, but I will include a brief summary of what's involved so you can see the connection, because I think that would be helpful. But this is a situation I have run into more often than I would have liked, and I first met this situation in my first year of priesthood. And for 47 years, well, 45 of them, up to the time I finished at the cathedral, I had seen this situation at least once every year and maybe more. Where? We're already married in a way the state recognizes. This is our first marriage. And I want our marriage recognized by the Catholic Church, but my spouse won't agree to a marriage ceremony using the Catholic form and ritual. The same thing, by the way, get rid of that. The same thing has happened, since I work in the tribunal. I've also had people call up after they got an annulment, and they want to get married in the church, and all of a sudden, Father, I got the annulment, thank you for your help, but my husband, my wife doesn't want to have a church marriage. Okay, so that happens. As I said, I was surprised. I would have expected it to happen a lot less frequently than it does. And when I talked to other priests, I found out it's a fairly common experience among our priests going back even, for the 47 years that I've been a priest. Thank God it's not the majority, but it's a significant number of times. And so I wanted to mention it tonight because it may be your situation, or you may know a situation where somebody wants to get their marriage blessed in the church. They could do it, except that the other party doesn't want to participate. The Catholic who wants the marriage recognized by the Catholic Church has an interview with the Catholic priest or deacon. And there's a special form for that interview available from the diocesan office. I suppose you could request it, but it's no help to you. It's the interview the priest has to do. He has to get it, so you should make sure he gets it. To grant this healing, this sanation at the roots, one needs what? Obviously, the certificates of Catholic baptism and confirmation for the Catholic party. If the other party is baptized and there's some way of proving it, that would be helpful. But you don't have to do that. The person that wants this has to produce the proof of their Catholic baptism and confirmation. They also have to produce proof that they and the one they're married to now are free to marry. And sometimes the best way to do that, there are a couple ways to do that. But in most cases, if I as a priest say to this person at once, can you bring me a copy of the long form of your marriage certificate? Now, why the long form? Because the long form has information that asks if this is the first marriage of each, right? So if they can bring in the long form and it shows clearly, that when they married, both people, it was their first marriage, or widow and widower, or something like that. If you can show that from the certificate of the marriage, and yes, you can get a civil marriage certificate for a church wedding, if it took place in another church. So some proof of freedom to marry. The reason I'm going through this is oftentimes when somebody needs this type of solution, they can't even get the other party, even though it's a husband or wife, to cooperate to get documents. Okay. Yeah, believe it or not, the marriage, I know the situations. The marriage is stable, the couple's getting along, they've got kids, sometimes grandchildren, but just the other party says, no, I don't, for whatever reason, I don't believe, I don't want the Catholic Church getting involved in my stuff, I'm not going to help. So oftentimes the person who wants this has to go do some work, and the proof of freedom to marry is most easily obtainable if the couple that's already married, if they get the certificate of their civil marriage with the long form. And sometimes, I can tell people too, you can go ask where you got married, you can ask for if they have the application for the marriage license, but many times they don't. But what they do have in New Jersey and every other state I've dealt with is a form that is a long form that has all the data on it. Who the parents were, the birth date of each, where they were living at the time, and what was the number of that person's marriage at this point. And so we're looking for it to say either it's the first marriage, or in New Jersey it's 0, they weren't married before, or you have a place in Jersey to check for widow, widower, you have a place to check for divorced. But you want to show divorced. You want to make sure it's one of the others. So proof of freedom to marry. Oops. Oh, come on. What's going on here? Why did it back up? Here we go. Let's do it again. All right. Then the certificate of civil or religious marriage. Now, religious marriage would be if they got married, by a minister of any denomination. And finally, the completed and signed petition or request for the sanation of the marriage. That's another form that the priest gets from the diocese. And then the parish priest has to recommend, or deacon has to recommend it. The parish priest or deacon who first determines that the marriage itself is stable and that the other spouse will not participate in a Catholic form of marriage ceremony. Those two things are important because there are times when people come to the church to get their marriage recognized because the marriage is on the rocks, and they think that getting it recognized will get it back on track. There are some who've actually had that work. The vast majority of people, it doesn't. I don't know how many annulment cases I've had where we dealt with a case where they were married outside the church for X number of years, had the marriage blessed in the church this year, and 2 years later, or 1 month later, they were broken up because the blessing didn't take, as one person said to me, "Father, the blessing didn't take." Well, you weren't getting it blessed. You were asking, essentially, when you convalidate a marriage, you're asking for people to make a new act of consent, to consent anew to the marriage. And if they're not getting along already, that's a pretty tough thing to ask people to do. So you want the recommendation of the parish priest who can determine if the marriage is stable and that the other spouse will not participate in the Catholic form of marriage ceremony, which normally means the priest has to ask the other party, or should ask the other party, "Are you willing?" And I've done that, in many cases done that without any problem. Didn't create any tension between the husband and wife, and the party who didn't want to do it would explain to me the reasons. And I thought it would be fair if I just gave you a couple of the reasons so you know. Number one, I'm not Catholic. I don't believe in what you do. According to my church or my religion, what I did the first time is my marriage, and I don't want to do anything that, in my view, compromises that. So you have the person who argues from principle. Then you have the person who says, I don't want to do it because I don't think this is going to last. That's scary. Then you have the person who says, I don't want to do it because I don't believe in your church. I don't believe in what you believe in. And I would think that coming to your church and doing a marriage ceremony would almost be like professing the faith. And I can't, now it isn't, but that's how they look at it. So you have the people who don't want to do it based on the principle that, they're not subject to the Catholic Church. There are those who don't want to do it because they're afraid that this looks to others like they're becoming Catholic, and they don't want that. And you have those who don't want to do it because they're afraid the marriage isn't going to work. And that's one where the pastor has to get really seriously involved and ask the questions. I had one case very early in my priesthood where the individual, this was a very complex situation because the man was Catholic and he had rejected the faith. And the woman was coming into the Catholic Church. And to do that, was again the question, do you come into the Catholic Church first and then get your marriage blessed, and get your marriage blessed, and then come into the, what do you do first? But the point was, in this particular situation, she was going to come into the Catholic Church first and then make her sacraments. So what does that mean? I have to dispense, the bishop has to give a permission for this marriage to take place. Well, yeah, but the gentleman who was Catholic isn't going to do a wedding. Yet it's clear that the marriage is stable and lasting, and they're going to keep it together. But sanation really isn't open to non-Catholics. You see what I mean? It gets complex. I simply want to point out to you that just because it's complex doesn't mean you can't use it or you can't ask for it. And sure enough, this is way back when, Bishop Reese, God rest his soul, Bishop Barr was still the bishop, and Bishop Reese was in charge of the tribunal. Bishop Reese sent a query over to one of the offices, the Pope's offices in Rome, and said, can we do this? And they wrote back and said, sure, absolutely. Yeah. As long as you're certain that the man the Catholic man who seems to have rejected the faith is still committed to his marriage, and as long as you're sure the woman is coming into the church. So, I'm just letting you know that this idea of a radical sonation normally involves the Catholic asking and the non-Catholic refusing. But we've had situations where the non-Catholic has asked and the Catholic has refused. 2 Catholics and 1 Catholic has refused. We've got all the scenarios. If you can imagine it, it has happened. So, what's important to remember then is, come on up here. Okay, there we go. With a radical sonation, there is no marriage ceremony or renewal of wedding vows. There isn't any. That's why it's called a sonation. You don't have a ceremony. It isn't like one person comes and says the vows and the other one doesn't. There is no marriage ceremony or renewal of the wedding vows. Instead, the bishop issues a decree healing or sonating the marriage, recognizing it. The parish priest records the fact of the sonation in the parish marriage register, and a certificate of Catholic marriage can be issued, and the Catholic spouse or spouses can return to the full practice of the Catholic faith. Oh, you mean if there's a Catholic who didn't want to do this, they get the favor too? Yeah, we don't... Look, if you're married in the church, both are married. It's not like one's married in the church. If both are married in the church, they're both are married in the church, and if both happen to be Catholic, they can take advantage of it. But at any rate, it's important to realize this is the most important element. Besides the element of the person who wants it asking for it, the most important element is that there is no marriage ceremony. You don't get in front of the church. You don't even have to bring witnesses in. You do, by the way, the person who wants this does come back. In the current practice, the person does come back to the priest or deacon who issued this, and in this diocese, we do it this way. When the bishop issues it, he still asks that the pastor or deacon, see the person who wants it and ask them, do you really want this? Here it is, it's done, do you want it? Because it can always be revoked if they've changed their mind, before they accept it. So in our diocese, we have, it's not part of the universal rule, but it's a practice here where we ask the person who wants it, after a bishop has agreed to grant it, do you still want it? And then once they accept it, then the parish priest enters it, and a certificate of Catholic marriage is issued. Before I go on, any questions? Yes?
If you do the sonation and an annulment has to take place before you even do anything, can you still do a sonation after an annulment has been granted?
I'm hesitating because the answer would be normally no, but there are times when it can be. And I really, it's so, what's the word I want? If I said yes, it would have to be for every case, and I know cases where it couldn't be used. They had to renew consent. The annulment wasn't sufficient. And there'll be a part of here that I'll touch a little later on where you might see why, if they got an annulment, you would want more than just one person saying, I want this. Okay? All right, so. Now, what if either spouse had a prior marriage and the former spouse is still alive? Well, when asked about divorce, Jesus explained God's plan for marriage did not include divorce. At the same time, Jesus showed mercy, for instance, to the woman of Samaria who had multiple husbands. As you remember that famous gospel that's read in Lent, and the woman says, I don't have a husband, and Jesus says, well, that's right, you've had 5, and the one you have now is not your husband, and in that you've spoken the truth. So Jesus showed mercy to that woman, and she became almost an apostle for him. So how do you balance the teaching with the mercy? And this is where the church from its infancy has had to deal with the reality of divorce. You can actually find divorce issues here and there in the New Testament beyond the Gospels. You can find it in the writings of St. Paul, even one instance where a situation that was created in the community happened to be mentioned, by the way, in the Acts of the Apostles. And the actual practice has varied over time and was different in Western and Eastern Christendom. As I said, the practice has developed over time. In the East, the Eastern churches and the Eastern Orthodox, first of all, nobody started this right away. I mean, we're looking at 7th and 8th century before even any thought to remarriage was considered in the church. I mean, it was simply, in the first 2.5, 3 centuries of Christendom, you didn't even remarry after death. You didn't. That's why you find in the Acts of the Apostles mention of the groups of widows, because you didn't, when you were Christian, your marriage was once forever, I mean, for eternity. So you did not marry again after death of the spouse. And that custom gradually changed. And in the Eastern Christendom, the whole issue of what do you do when a marriage breaks up was a major subject of what were called the synods. In the church we've had ecumenical councils, but other than that we've had synods or meetings of bishops. And though the records that were preserved there show that the whole issue of what do you do, how do you minister to people who are divorced, that's back to the 3rd century, the 200s. You know, it's always been. Eventually in the Eastern Church, what they settled on was permitting remarriage in limited cases, but then only to the innocent spouse. So if for example, they permitted remarriage in a case of adultery, the victim or the non-adulterous spouse could remarry, and the adulterous one could never marry again. And I recently attended a meeting of an ecumenical gathering of clergy. It happened to be most of the bishops of Eastern Orthodox churches. There's a dialogue going on nationally between the Orthodox and Catholics on a lot of different issues. One of them is marriage. And the bishops there assured me that that's still their practice in most of the Orthodox churches. Remarriage is permitted only in limited cases and only to the innocent spouse. It's an ancient tradition. It's an ancient practice. In the West, there developed the practices of annulment and dissolution of marriage, and those practices developed long after the Eastern practice. In fact, it wasn't until the 11th century that the church decided that non-consummation of marriage was not a basis to declare a marriage invalid. I mean, that's what I'm trying to make sure you understand clearly, that how this was dealt with in the church evolved over the period of time. So the practices that developed were annulment and dissolution of marriage. Annulment was given if the consent to the marriage was invalid, and the marriage could be dissolved, normally by the power of the Pope, if the marriage was never a sacrament or if it was never consummated. Briefly, what does an annulment mean? A declaration of a Catholic Church tribunal that at the time of the wedding ceremony, that's important, at that moment, there was a serious defect that existed that made invalid the marriage consent and prevented the formation of the bond of marriage. That's what we're dealing with when we deal with the concept of annulment. If we're dealing with the concept of dissolution, there are only 2 circumstances: when the marriage was not a sacrament or when the marriage was not consummated. The marriage is not a sacrament because one or both of the spouses in the prior marriage was not baptized. In our teaching, the marriage of 2 baptized persons, if they're truly baptized, that's a sacrament whether they know it is or not, whether they're Catholic or not. If they're two baptized Baptists or 2 baptized non-Catholics of any denomination who marry, if they're baptized, it's a sacrament from our point of view. So you can't dissolve that marriage, but you can dissolve one if one or both of the spouses was not baptized. There is no danger of scandal from doing that, no possibility of reconciliation, and a request is made for the privilege of the faith. So somebody who was in that previous marriage has to ask for it. And finally, the privilege of faith is granted according to the circumstances of the case and the procedure established for it. And because those circumstances and the procedure is somewhat detailed and beyond what I plan to talk about tonight, it'd be great to do it. We usually do it in the preparation when we do talks about annulments. This is included. But it's just the privilege of the faith is granted according to the circumstances and according to the procedure established for it. And there's 2 different kinds of privileges and 2 different procedures involved. When a marriage wasn't consummated, what does that mean? Not consummated. After the wedding, no completed sexual union in a human manner between a man and the woman already married to each other. A petition is made and prepared in the diocesan tribunal, is sent to the Holy Father, and the decree dissolving the marriage can be granted only by the Pope. We don't have many of these, in part because, people are sexually active before marriage. That doesn't make the marriage consummated, but it certainly means they're more likely to consummate it after they get married. They're more likely to have a complete act of sexual relations after marriage. But we have had cases, a few, where that didn't happen, and for various reasons. It could be established that there was no sexual communication between them after they married. The inhuman manner was inserted actually in the teaching of Pope St. John Paul II to deal with cases where the only consummation after the marriage was the result of rape. And the Church, recognizing that a violent act is not consummation. And so the Pope he even added it to the 1983 Code of Canon Law when that was published, that the consummation has to occur in a human manner. Then, between the man and the woman already married to each other, will you say, no, wait a minute, wouldn't that be understood? Well, no. The marriage isn't consummated if they don't have sex with each other, but the man lends his sperm to the woman's ova for an in vitro or other type of fertilization. If they don't have a sexual act, the marriage isn't consummated, even if children result from it, in one of the several medical ways in which that can happen. Okay. So it has to be between the man and the woman already married to each other. The petition is made and prepared in the diocesan tribunal, and frankly, any diocesan tribunal can do it. And the decree dissolving the marriage can be granted only by the Pope. With a decree of annulment or dissolution of the prior marriage, a new marriage in the Catholic Church becomes possible. The customary marriage preparation is observed, and the new marriage is either celebrated or convalidated according to the Catholic form and ritual. Once again, it depends on the decree you get. You say, this is just like with annulments. The question is, could you do this with a radical sanation? And normally the decrees that come back insist that a ceremony take place for the completion of in other words, for the marriage to be validated, the decree says they have to, follow the Catholic form of marriage. I've never had a request for a sanation in a situation like this. If I did and I was really concerned about it, I would tell the Holy See ahead of time, this is a concern, would you also grant with it the permission for the radical sanation? But it's never happened. But the answer is, if the dissolution is, if it's a dissolution for privilege of the faith or non-consummation, those decrees usually come back from Rome saying, no, they have to give consent in the form prescribed by law. So, and if they can't for some reason, then we have to go back and find another solution. Now, I added this in here. What are the essential basic elements of marriage in the Catholic teaching? Because the question is, when people ask to have their marriage recognized by the Church, they want to either convalidate it or they want to have it senated. Their consent to the marriage has to be genuine. So what does it have to include? They have to consent to marry for the rest of their lives, permanence. They have to consent to an exclusive relationship, fidelity, no other sexual partners. They have to consent to openness to the procreation and education of children. You can never guarantee procreation. Okay. Once you have children, you certainly can commit to educating them. And finally, they have to agree to their mutual or common good as spouses. Now, that's a fairly new element of consent that's been introduced actually as a result of the teaching of the Second Vatican Council, and it's been enshrined in the 1983 Code of Canon Law. It does go back to the time when we said that the two purposes of marriage were the procreation of children and the mutual help of the spouses to each other, but that mutual help was never considered an essential element of marriage consent. Just the children aspect was. Well, with the Vatican Council made clear that yes, that mutual help is every bit as essential. So that when a person says, I marry you not for our common good, but for purposes outside of marriage, then that marriage consent isn't given. And you say, well, when would that happen? Well, I can tell you a lot of times, having worked in the city of Trenton all this time, that people often were getting married even civilly, just to get their immigration status verified, to get a green card, as they say. I mean, people would do it for that reason. People would do it because I need somebody to help with the kids. Anybody will do, as long as it's somebody can help with the kids. Well, you say that people don't do that. Not often, but they do it, okay? So the mutual or common good of the spouses is the focus of the elements. Permanence and fidelity, procreation and education of children, at least openness to procreation, and then the consent to educate if they have children. And finally, their mutual or common good as spouses. Those are the basic elements. They have to both be free to give that consent to marry each other, free from any external or internal force or compulsion to marry, and free from any impediment to marriage. And I want to underline that freedom extends to senations. They have to be free from any external or internal force or compulsion. And they have to be free from any impediment to marriage. Impediment, for example, I'm a priest. I'm impeded from marrying. My priesthood is an impediment to marriage. I can't marry. The state might let me marry and divorce as often as I wanted to. The church says you can never marry validly because you're a priest. I would have to be dispensed from the obligations of the priesthood in order to be able to marry validly, and that dispensation can only come from the Pope. So that's an impediment. If I'm not baptized, I'm impeded from marrying. When you have a marriage between a Catholic and an unbaptized person, the priest or deacon has to ask the bishop for a special permission called a dispensation to allow that marriage to take place. Blood relationship up to first cousins and closer, can't marry validly in the Catholic Church. They would have, brothers and sisters, parents and children can never marry. There's no dispensation there. But first cousins might be dispensed. Uncle and niece or aunt and nephew might be dispensed, might be. Unfortunately, those marriages still aren't legal in the state of New Jersey, so at least as far as I know, they're not. So again, they have to be free from any external or internal force or compulsion, and they have to be free from an impediment to marriage. Then they have to be able to consent. They have to have sufficient use of reason. They have to be able to understand and judge accurately about those basic elements, faithfulness, permanence, children, mutual help or partnership. They have to be able to understand and judge accurately about the basic elements, and they have to be able to accept and fulfill those basic elements. And there are many times when people aren't able to do number 2 or 3, but I have had cases in which, because of alcohol intoxication or drug intoxication, a person at a wedding was not able to exercise sufficient use of reason at the wedding, although at other times they might have had it. Okay? And we even had one case, which isn't quite the same as this, where the priest who did the wedding was so intoxicated that he was incapable of acting as the church's official witness. And the marriage was invalid because there was no form observed. It was a very unusual case. But we have had a number of cases and situations where people have come afterwards and said, I was so drunk at the wedding, I didn't even remember that it happened. And I remember a case in which the case was introduced and both parties participated, surprisingly. I was surprised that they did. But they said, we got married. These were 2 non-Catholics, so they didn't have to worry about Catholic form. We got married, and we were both so stoned, whatever substances they were using. We were so stoned that we didn't realize what we were doing. The next day, when we kind of sobered up, we saw that we had a marriage certificate on our table, and both of us said, how did that get there? So we went down to the city hall and found out that we had actually been there and actually gone through a wedding ceremony. Oh. Now those are odd cases, but those are examples when you say sufficient use of reason. It is not just somebody who might be mentally deranged or someone who was intellectually so infirm that they couldn't know what they were doing. You need to be aware that that is a situation that does occur sometimes. So when somebody's getting married in the church, or even when they're seeking this sanation, they need to have sufficient use of reason. They have to be able to understand and judge accurately. They have to be able to accept and fulfill the basic elements of marriage. The consent of the husband and wife to marry must be given with sufficient knowledge, without deceit or fraud, and without reservation. No ifs, no buts, and I wrote in here, no prenuptial agreements or contracts. I would be less than honest if I didn't tell you that there might be some prenuptial agreements that don't interfere with marriage consent. And of course, in our diocese, if a couple has them, the situation has to be referred to the family life office to determine whether this is sufficient to block the marriage or not. But typically, prenuptial agreements are made in view of divorce. Well, the church teaches, your consent to marriage cannot be conditional. You can't go in and say, I'll stay married as long as. And so if you're making a prenuptial agreement to protect yourself in the event of divorce, are you intending a permanent marriage? Or are you intending one that could be dissolved if it doesn't work? And that's why that issue comes up. That's why I put in no prenuptial agreements or contracts. Questions up to this point?
Yeah.
Sure.
So two people, Catholics cannot get married with a prenuptial agreement.
Technically, I shouldn't say they can't. I mean, the position the church has taken in the whole state of New Jersey is, if they have one, it has to be presented to the diocese. It goes in our case, to the family life. They present it to the bishop. Because technically, only the bishop can prohibit marriage. The law doesn't prohibit it. The law says you can't marry if you don't consent to the elements. But is this prenuptial agreement indeed a hedging of your consent? That determination is entirely in the bishop's hands. So the issue has to be referred to the diocese. The family life office looks into it. They present their findings to the bishop, and he says, yes, you can go ahead and get married or not. All right? Okay? So it doesn't mean automatically. However, when a marriage comes for annulment and there has been a prenuptial agreement that hasn't been dealt with, that's one of the things that the tribunal wants to look at and see if that was in fact the same as suspending your consent for marriage. I'm not really giving my full consent to marriage because I'm keeping open the possibility of divorce. So the church would at least look at it at that point. Now, before I have something else to do here, but before I do, I need to underline a couple of things here. For people who want to return to the full practice of the faith, if they're not married in the church, that is a block, but it may not be the only problem they're facing. And as I was preparing this, I thought, my goodness, if I start talking about all the other things that might stand in the way, you'll be here all night. So I thought the best thing to do was simply acknowledge to you that it's possible that in addition to not being married in the church, there may be other issues that they have that are holding them back from trying to get their marriage fixed, as we say, get their marriage in the church. And even if they get their marriage in the church, they may have other issues keeping them from resuming the full practice of the faith. And so that's where we say to couples, please talk to your parish priest or your deacon. In my experience, probably, I don't know, certainly less than 50 times in 47 years, has anybody ever approached me in confession? And of course, I couldn't tell you who or what, but approached me in confession about this thing. And the few that have, I've always said, look, I have to talk to you about this outside of confession, because in order to help you, I've got to do stuff that I have to talk to other people about, and I can't if it's in confession. So, people have always agreed to talk to me afterwards. But the first element to keep in mind is that even if it may be simply at the visible level, Jane and John aren't married by the church, but there may be other issues, not simply, and maybe not even related to the matter of their marriage, that keeps them from being fully reconnected with the church. And those issues need to be dealt with as well. One case in which I was involved the case of the man who had seriously rejected the Catholic faith. He had many, many objections to it, and he was willing to say, I'll go through a ceremony, I'll do whatever you want, so we could have dealt with that. But he still didn't want his wife coming to church. He didn't want to go with her and didn't want her coming on her own. And so we had to deal with that issue. That's an example of what I'm saying is things are never, as you all live human life, things are never as simple as you think they are, right? They're almost never as simple. There's always some complexity here. So keep in mind that returning to the church, coming home for couples married outside the church, may not just involve getting them married in the church, may not just involve a question of a reluctant spouse, may not involve an annulment. There may be other issues. And those are enough that I felt I couldn't be devoting slides to all of them because there are just so many different ones that I've run into in all my years of priesthood. But it is something that you want to help somebody approach a priest or deacon or whoever gets people started in marriage preparation, somebody who's understanding and cooperative and will help them to sort out the issues to begin to get this thing put in place. Now, our Holy Father recently introduced some changes to the annulment process, and I figured I have to bring this up because I couldn't imagine anybody sitting here that hasn't heard about them and wondering about those, even if it doesn't apply to you or you don't need it. Is it true that, first of all, the church annulment procedures will move more quickly? Well, the answer is, of course, they all will now, because even almost all will, because some annulment and dissolution cases are already done in 1 or several months, and others whose processes used to require extra time for permissions or appeals will be shortened whenever no permissions or appeals are needed. And based on our experience, I would have to say that's going to be 90% of the time. It used to be you had to get somebody else's permission to do a case. If, like Trenton would have to get permission from another diocese, if we were not the diocese where the couple married or the diocese where the ex lived. Now we don't have to get those permissions anymore. And every case that required an appeal, where the law required an automatic appeal after the annulment was granted, that's gone. So the only chance now for appeal is if the ex is opposed and wants to appeal. And our experience has been that rarely happens. I mean, rarely happens. Less than 50% of the time do the exes even participate. And when they do, at least half the time they're in agreement, or at least not opposed. So will they move more quickly? Yeah, I would hope so. I mean, this alone will cut 3 months off every case, right off. So that to me is a big help. Will the church annulment procedures cost less or even nothing? In the Trenton Diocese, in fact, as of now in the whole state of New Jersey, they will not cost more, but reductions and waivers of fees are always granted in hardship situations. We've always done it. All the dioceses in New Jersey, every diocese has done it. Some dioceses, I think there's about 21 in the United States so far, who have indicated that they will not, charge anything. And I don't know whether that's going to grow or not. I just don't know where that's going. And I'd like to tell you why in two simple things. Okay? First of all, the stories about humongous fees in the thousands were never true in the United States. They might have been true in other countries. I can't judge them, but they weren't true here, ever. Even now, the highest cost for any tribunal for any tribunal process in any diocese in New Jersey, the top is $800. Nothing more. That's the top. Normally, it's generally somewhere between $50 and $600. But that's not 800 is the top. So it's not thousands to begin with. Secondly, in our diocese, we regularly grant reductions or waivers of fees whenever there's a situation that the person really cannot afford the fee or can't. And people, you know, as long as we make sure to explain to people that your pleading, your request for a reduction or waiver of the fee is not going to mean that your case is going to take longer. It's not like we're going to punish you for not paying, all right? That's not the case. But we always ask people to let us know up front, and especially if there's a hardship, because if there's a hardship there may be other pastoral considerations that you want to keep in mind in doing this, okay? But anyhow, in Pope Francis's apostolic letter about this process, he comments that we need to be sensitive to the expense of the process, not just in terms of the charge the tribunal places, but upon the issues of convenience or inconvenience of access to the tribunal. And for that reason, he said, it is to be preferred that the tribunal handle the case, that tribunal handle the case where the people are most accessible to it. You know, that's an interesting point. You know, you can always do an annulment in the diocese where you marry. You can do it where the person who wants it lives, where the ex lives, the diocese wherever the proofs are. But the new direction says it really ought to be done where the person who has to make the decision can be most conveniently in touch with the people who are involved, that is the parties. It's an interesting point to make. Again, so it even says in the tribunal, for example, in interviewing the parties or interviewing witnesses or whatever the tribunal has to do, to not impose additional charges on them or cost to them. And one of the examples that they gave was, for example, not demanding that they give up a day of work to come in and do it. So it wasn't just about not less money. It had to do with more a greater sensitivity to the people's needs and what you're asking them to do. So for that reason, and there's another reason why I'm not. That's one reason. There's a real reason why I don't want to get rid of expenses entirely. Why I like to have a standard set of fees. Because if you have no standard set, meaning you don't charge anything, or you don't have a standard set, give whatever you can, immediately people are going to think, well, the more you give, the more you get. Okay? When you have a consistent set of fees and said it's between this and this, no less, no more, and if you give more, it's going to be sent back, and we've done that. When people have given more, we send it back, okay, get it back. But the point is that gives you some objectivity to the process so that you can prove. You can't just tell people, but you can prove by documents. Your whole list of cases, without showing the names, but the list of cases with the fees actually charged and paid, that you have not taken any more than this amount of money. So money has not entered into it. And then when you grant when you grant the waiver or reduction, the priest who grants it, the judge who grants it, writes a letter saying, I grant a reduction for this reason. So there it is. And so you can't, it's not that people won't accuse you, but there's no objective evidence out there that would support them. Where if you abolish the fee process entirely but accept donations, you open that whole door once again. And if you abolish fees and you don't accept donations, think about this, and you don't accept donations, you insult the people who want to be grateful. Okay? There is wisdom. Okay? The reason why our Holy Father took this position was because he was dealing with a situation in much of the world where the fees are in the thousands of dollars and where the process takes forever. Not just 1 year or 8 months or 12 months or a year and a half, but we're looking 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, sometimes 10 years in other parts of the world. Even where Pope Francis came from, he was aware of the fact that a case in his tribunal might take 3 or 4 years and cost the people a couple $1,000s, and then it went to the appeal court where they had to pay more money to the appeal court, and that was another $1,000 or $2,000. So, he knew that the process was out of financial reach for most of his people. And that's what he wants to avoid. And I think we've long since addressed that issue and resolved it. I hope we have. And then last but, oops, it's not, no. What's the matter here? Why is it backing up? Not allowed to back up. I'm using the left. It's backing up. I'm using the shift key, the enter key here. I don't know. Don't ask me. I don't know. What do I know? Now, the last, is there a new, easier annulment process? Because everybody heard about that one. Yes, there is. There's one that you could, well, those of us that have calculated the time figure, it was presented as 45 days, but no, the minimum amount of time you could expect to do that in would be probably double that. You'd probably have 90 days, 3 months, probably be the minimum time. Because although it gave 2 periods of time, it gave 15 days for this and 30 days for that, but it didn't mention that there was also another 10 days here and another 20 days there and another, that you have to observe. But anyway, this easier annulment process, what it does is it eliminates the time between the cases is accepted and the time you make a decision. That period of time is 30 days. Once the tribunal accepts the case, the judge sets a period of time within 30 days when both parties have to answer, any other proofs have to be presented. At the end of the 30 days, you get 15 days to review it, and the bishop makes a decision. So but it's getting it accepted first that may take the time. But anyway, it will require both the husband and wife who are now divorced to agree to the annulment. Now remember, I already told you half the time they don't answer at all, okay? And when they do answer, half agree or half don't object, and the other half object. Well, this doesn't just say don't object, it requires them both to agree to the annulment. And then the proof for the annulment has to be easy to obtain. So I don't know how many people are going to qualify for that, because in our practice we have never asked people in the process to talk to their exes. If they're not in communication regularly for other reasons, we don't ask them. And we all think, when I say we think, I think that we don't want this process that is supposed to be easier to suddenly become more painful because you have to talk to your ex. Now, there is a way around it. When the case comes in, we do what we normally do, and we immediately notify the ex saying, that's the first notifications that go out. One goes to the ex saying, so-and-so is seeking a church annulment of this marriage. Do you agree? Do you object? Do you want to participate? So if they wrote back and said, I don't object, that doesn't qualify. If they write back and say, I agree, all of a sudden this case might become a lot easier to do without the two parties talking to each other. But the problem is going to be, so when people talk to you about, we got this thing is much easier, well, we've already shaved 3 months off the process anyway, so that should make a difference even in our diocese. We're not going to charge less, we're not going to charge more, and it's always been easy to request and obtain a reduction and waiver of fee. And yes, there is an easier process, but both parties have to cooperate with it, and the proof has to be easy to obtain. So how that's going to work out in practice, I don't know. I just know that if things continue, if human nature is what it is and people are doing annulments still have the same issues that are going on, the same kind of issues, there aren't going to be many cases when the two of them will agree. And more than half the time, the other party won't ever respond. And you can't use silence as agreement. It's just, yeah, if they don't answer, you can't use silence. And so what's that going to do? I don't know, except that I'm thinking right off the top of my head, I'm back in the tribe. I retired 2 years ago in 2013, and I'm back because my successor got sick. I've been helping in the diocese, helping the new judicial vicar with the cases. Probably will continue for a while. But my experience right now is that the cases are roughly moving somewhere in the 12 to 15 month area. Before we were somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 to 13 months, and we're back into the 12 to 15 month area for most of the cases. Hopefully, since a month of that is in many cases getting permission and 2 months in the appeal process, hopefully we can kick the 15 months back to 12. But I'd like to be able to kick the 12 months back too. And I don't know how easy we're going to do that without additional canon law staff to make it happen. So, other questions? Yes?
This has to do with sanation, but that whole concept in the Holy Father about easy access for people to find sanation, does it have to be the bishop where they live or where the marriage took place?
Neither. It's a bishop.
Okay, it's where
They're living in the Trenton Diocese, so we give it to the Trenton Bishop. Well, example, I mean, because we're right across the river from Philly. If they're coming across from Philly, obviously we have to submit the petition to the Archdiocese of Philadelphia. If they live there, that's where I have to send it, yeah.
All right, the second question is related. It used to be jurisdiction was where either couple lives, either the divorced people live, where they were married or where they're living now. Three choices. With access, if there's...
No, yes, where they got married, where either one of them lived, where the proofs were to be found. Those remain. What's different is you don't have to get permission from the other side as you used to have to get.
Because if somebody, say somebody was very oriented to Mercer County, didn't get married here, and one party, they only recently moved over the line to Middlesex County, would they be able to, easy access for them might be Trenton. They would have to go through Kentucky or Philly for easy access?
Are we talking about annulments, or are we talking about...
Now I'm moving to annulments.
Okay, if you're talking about annulments, the same four things apply. Where do they get married? Where do they live? Where does the ex live? Where the proofs are? That is there. And quite frankly, if they're living in Middlesex County, trust me, it's a lot easier to drive to Piscataway, which is where the Diocese of Metuchen office is,
I'm just thinking
than to drive here.
Philadelphia is a nightmare.
No, but they don't have to go to Philly.
No, I mean if they just say move there, but
If they move to Pennsylvania, then the question is still the same. What are the four sources? Where does the present and the ex now live? Where did the wedding take place that they got married? Where are the...
if they're crossing the river to come to Mass and say, try to...
Well, let's assume that everything's in Philly. Then they go to Philly, yeah. And yeah, I mean, the Philadelphia Tribunal is making a real effort to do the same thing that we're doing. So God bless them. Question?
Convalidations. Do we need a new civil license?
By civil law, yes, you do. It's called a civil remarriage license. But this is one of those wonderful things that in New Jersey, registrars tend to be rather independent people. Kentucky is not the only place where you can find an independent registrar, okay? And so I always tell the pastors, I always used to tell them, have the couple ask in the town where you're going to do this, or the town where they're living, do they need a remarriage license? If the clerk says yes, get it. If the clerk says no, forget it. Don't worry about it. The civil law of the state requires that every act we do, every marriage we do in church have some civil paperwork to back it up. But I am not going to, no way am I going to enter into any battle with a civil registrar over that issue, because they're already married. They already have proof that they're married civilly. In some state recognizes their marriage. Okay, so I don't, from legal purposes, they don't need what I'm doing. So I always tell the priest, ask if they have to get a civil remarriage license, or ask the clerk of the town. Clerk will tell you. And trust me, in Mercer County, some do, some don't. And I'll leave it at that. No criticism intended. Okay, thank you. Let me go ahead. Wait, one more thing here. And they live happily ever after, don't we wish, right? But do let us say, if you can read it, let us say this prayer together. O Lord, our God, we give you thanks for holding our love in your hands. Help us to fulfill our mission. Come and share our lives. Help us to guide our children, to be witnesses of your love in our family and the community. Strengthen us in time of weakness. Rejoice with us in our victories, and always bless our love, O Lord. Amen. May the blessing and peace of Almighty God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit come upon you this evening and stay with you forever. Amen. God bless and thank you.